Thanks for joining me for this next video tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about focal point. Now, what exactly is focal point? Anytime that you go out and photograph a subject, there is a point within that photograph that the eye specifically concentrates on. In other words, it's a particular area that's within an image that the eye is drawn to. Now, this is accomplished by using two different elements. The first element is composition. The second element is the focal length of the lens that you shoot with. What we're going to talk about in this video tutorial is how those two elements come together and work together to create a specific focal point within an image. And we're going to have many different examples, and I'll be illustrating that next. Okay, what I've done is actually bring an image into my photo editor to illustrate the focal point. Now, understand that focal point has three major characteristics to it. It has composition, focal length, and perspective. We must understand that all three of these elements, composition, focal length, and perspective, play a part in creating a particular focal point in an image. When we look at this image, we can see that it's from a low perspective, and our actual focal point of this image is right up here in the center of the image. Now, understand that if we changed our composition left or right, it would have changed that focal point. In other words, that focal point would have moved either left or right. If we went left, the focal point would have went to the right. And if we went right, the focal point would have moved to the left. So depending on what you want that focal point to be will determine partially what your composition and your perspective are going to be. So when you pull all three of those elements together, you get a specific focal point in the image. Let's think about focal length for a minute. When we look at this image, you can tell it was shot with a fairly wide lens. In fact, it was shot with a 17 to 55 millimeter lens. The actual focal length on it was about 38 millimeter. But had we shot this with a 100 millimeter or a 200 millimeter or a 300 millimeter, our focal point from this perspective would have been exactly the same. It just would have been closer. So essentially what you have to pay attention to is the choice of focal length in combination with your composition and your perspective to be able to create a particular point within that image so that the viewer travels to that point when they see your image. Let's take a look at another photograph that was shot in the same location. Our focal point has actually moved a little bit. It's a different subject, and our perspective has changed a bit. In other words, we've come up in our perspective a bit. But let's look at our focal point. Our focal point is actually right in this area here. And as you can see, it's almost dead center in the image. But look at all of this room over here. That's your composition. Our perspective, coupled with our composition, creates a particular focal point in the image. In other words, we want to come down this log out into the water, but we don't want to lose all of this area up here. We want that to be part of the image, and we want to be able to see all of the details that are down in the foreground. So choice of focal length is very, very important. But understand how important this focal point is. This focal point actually drags the viewer into the photograph and places them in a particular location so that they stay within the image itself. Let's take a look at another image. Let's take a look at a different type of image. Now, our perspective is a little different because we've actually placed the key elements of the image, which would be the rocks, closer to the camera. So what that does is actually drop our focal point down. Our focal point of this image is actually right here. Now, as you can see, the difference between this focal point and the one we looked at prior to this, where our focal point was up in this area, what we're doing is actually focusing across the subject into the photograph. So what happens is this color that's at the top of the frame actually drags the viewer through the image across the focal point and into the color. So the color is more of a filler to the image rather than a focal point of the image. Let's take a look at a little bit different type of image. Now, this image is shot at a low perspective also. It's shot with a wide angle lens. The action in this image, as you can see, is to the left of the frame. But where is our focal point? Our focal point for this image is actually right here on this little wave. Now, why is that? It's all because of the composition, the focal length that I used, and the perspective that I chose for this particular image. Understand that your focal point is going to fall at a particular point in the image, and that's where your viewer is actually going to travel to. So as you can see in this, by the composition, the viewer will travel past the action to this area, over to the other ladders, and back down to where the action is at, keeping the viewer within the image. That's the goal. You do not want to have an exit point somewhere where they leave the image and they lose interest. So these three elements come together, creating a focal point where the viewer will stay within the image. Let's take a look at a different type of image. Now understand that focal point is nothing more than a destination. It's a specific point within a photograph that you want the viewer to travel to. In this image, our focal point is on these pilings. Now, the reason that the focal point is there is a combination of the three elements: focal length, perspective, and composition. But look how our composition is. These posts drag the viewer in to our focal point, to our lighthouse, through the beams coming out of the sky, and back down to our pylons. The whole idea is there's no exit. Once the viewer gets into this image, they're going to look at it and see all the elements within, and hopefully they're going to stay and enjoy the image. Now, the focal point plays a huge role here. It's almost a subliminal. It's there and they don't realize that it's there. But if you understand how to use focal point, it will improve your composition and create much nicer images. That brings us to the end of this video tutorial on focal point. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next.